So look, welcome everyone to this British-Yemeni Society event this evening. I'm here to introduce Helen. And really, she needs no introduction. She's, I imagine, well known to all of you. But for those who might not know Helen, she is a French writer, academic, and researcher. She's now a resident and has been for a while in the UK. And she's well known for her work on the Middle East and Yemen in particular. I've known Helen since the late 1970s, so we go back a long, long way, when she was living in Aden back in PDRY times. So she has an enormous span of knowledge about the Yemen. For the best part of a decade, she was editor of the British-Yemeni Society Journal and an active member of our executive committee. Helen currently wears two hats. She's an associate researcher at SOAS and also a visiting fellow at ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations. Helen is an author or editor of a number of books, and I'll just mention a couple. Why Yemen Matters, A Society in Transition, was based on conference contributions held at BYS back in 2013-14. Yemen in Crisis, Autocracy, Neoliberalism, and the Disintegration of the State of a State was published in 2018 and went on to win prestigious award, the Grand Prix de la Recherche. I understand from Helen just now that a new updated version of this with an extra chapter will be out shortly. Watch that space. Helen's latest book, Yemen, Poverty and Conflict, is the subject of tonight's talk. I understand it was published back in July, and this talk will take the format of a discussion between Noel Brehony, whom you also no doubt know, and Helen. Noel was two terms chairman of British-Yemeni Society, among many other Middle Eastern Society chairmanships, and is himself author of many books on Yemen and the Middle East. We are aiming to finish this meeting at around 6:30, but I'll leave it up to Noel's judgment, depending on how many of your burning questions still remain at that point. Please ask your questions in the chat box. That's the way we're going to do it. And do that at any point, and Ibrahim is going to be looking at those and passing them on to be handled. So over to you now, Noel and Helen.
Okay, well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. This is more of an interview rather than a conversation. Right, I expect it will deteriorate into conversation. The book follows a particular structure, which is going to be developed for this particular series by Routledge. And I found in reading the book that this structure works very well in illuminating the problems in Yemen, which have led to the current situation. The four sections are one on modern state formation, actually the history. Next on the politics and disintegration of the nation. Then the constraints on the economy, and then international relations before reaching a conclusion. I find this works very, very well. And in this Q&A, I was going to follow that structure. So I hope that by the time we get to the final version, you'll be able to see how the problems of Yemen emerge, and I'll ask any questions at that stage. So I'm going to begin with the first one. Helen, you conclude the first chapter by saying, in the long-term perspective, it is clear that the area currently within the borders of the Republic of Yemen has never had lasting stability under a single ruling group. Cultural divisions between the Zaidi Highlands, the Shafai lowlands, and Hadramaut lowlands meant that more often than not, they were ruled by rival rulers. Centuries, if not millennia of history, clearly have contributed to the problems and fragmentation which are affecting the Republic of Yemen, which has existed for less than a generation. I found that, and the other things you said in your first chapter, are very illuminating in terms of the effect of history and geography on the current situation. But what do you think are the implications of history and geography today when looking at the current situation and territorial control and the likely future of Yemen?
Well, thank you, Noel, first, and thank you everybody for attending this meeting. And even more thanks to people who will actually find the time to read the book. and be more involved or find it more useful in their work connected with Yemen. I think on the answer to your question, Noel, is, I mean, I was surprised because it was the first time that I really delved into earlier history, to pre-20th century history of Yemen. I hadn't previously really focused on this. And I was really quite surprised by how, by how much it actually does illuminate the current situation. Insofar as if you look at the divisions that are taking place at the moment, not all of them are organized according to the current two main political entities. You see a revival of many of these earlier conflicts and of these earlier differences. So, it seems to me also in the previous years, whenever I was trying to split different bits of Yemen to try and figure out the different coherent groups, there's very clear overlap, but there's also, in a sense, you could say, 4 or 5 clearly distinct regional socio-cultural entities, which, you could say could be embryos of a nation, or alternatively not, because I also think that there is a certain level of a whole number of factors which really make a Yemeni and indicate a significant difference between a Yemeni and, say, a Saudi, an Emirati, or an Omani. And so you have basically, in my view, you actually do have something that I would call a Yemeni nation. But at the same time, within that nation, you have some fairly noticeable socio-economic and cultural differences. And these operate, in terms of religion, they operate in terms of food culture, of musical culture, and also in terms of geography, I mean, and of the economy. The economic base of the highlands is very different from the economic base of the coast. So I think, I suppose, I'm not sure what the lessons are for the future, because I'm really not at all sure what will happen. Well, I don't think I'm alone there. I don't think I know what's going to happen. So I wouldn't like to say much about this, except that, these commonalities as well as these differences should really be taken into consideration by those who are involved in making decisions and who are involved in planning their future in Yemen. And when I say this, I'm thinking not just of, the obvious political military leaders whose names we all know, but also people at the popular base, people in the communities and individuals, when they're thinking of themselves and their future. So I'm not sure to what extent that answers your question, but maybe you have your own comments on the topic.
Again, I was just so struck, in an earlier lecture we had, for 600 years, obviously medieval times, you had the Rasul leader, the various other regimes, very much in lower Yemen, with centers of Taiz and Zabi, and then the Imamate in the north, and constant competition for power between them. It doesn't look unlike some aspects of the current situation. That's why I asked the question. But can I go to the next? Do you see any parallels in the way that the Imams ruled and the Houthis are ruling currently? You mentioned quoting Stuckey, who wrote a very, very, very good book on the Yemen Arab Republic about 40, 50 years ago. The Zaydi rule depended on the oral suasion of the ulama and the military power of the tribes. Is that still, you think that's still a factor? And is it how the Houthis try and rule?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear. I mean, not only do the Houthis want to reinstate, increased power for the Sada, group, the descendants of the Prophet, of whom obviously the Imam was one. So, their fundamental policies, in a sense, are very similar in so far as they believe that the country should be ruled by people from that social group and not from any other social group. And similarly, the Houthis are currently in alliance with certain tribes, not with all, and indeed not with even all the elements of the same tribes that they are ruling with. So, there is that similarity. I would say that there's significant differences because, more than half a century has gone by since the end of the Imamate. And there's a whole host of differences. I mean, the country is, there's communication throughout the country. People can travel. The economy has changed entirely. The politics have changed enormously as well. But there's certainly an element of similarity. There's also, I think, if you look at it, there's a distinct difference between, between the Zaydi ulama who were in power, who were relevant in the Imam's days, and their descendants, who include some very progressive people, and the kind of Zaydism that, or in fact, a change of Zaydism that is being transformed by the Houthis. I mean, the Houthis are not following standard Zaydi beliefs; they are actually transforming them to get closer to Iranian 12 Shiism. So, there are similarities, but there's certainly not a copy-paste situation.
No. I think history is also important in the creation of separate states. I was thinking in particular of the border between North and South Yemen, which was essentially negotiated by the Ottomans and the British, as each was trying to extend their rule into Yemen in the late 19th century. And we saw the PDRY and the Yemen Arab Republic emerged as separate states, but always intertwined, I think. So perhaps just looking at those two states, what do you think were the strengths and weaknesses of the Yemen Arab Republic, particularly under the late President Saleh?
Well, I think to take up your first point about the borders, the 1934 agreement between the Imamate and the British on the borders around, Lahej and Daler and those areas, I mean, had really nothing to do with society. They split tribal groups, they split families in two. It was really a case of, who was vaguely, and I insist on the vaguely bit, paying allegiance to either the Imam or the British. So, that border has absolutely no objective rationale for it. And so I think that's a very important factor, particularly today when we talk about the Southern separatists, who use this border as if it was an actual meaningful, something or other. So I think that's, that's very important. I think to come to your question on the YAR, I think, one of the main, let's remember, Saleh stayed in power for 33 years. Okay, some of these years were on United Yemen, but basically, he was the main lasting ruler of the YAR from 1978 onwards, i.e. from 8 years after the civil war ended. So in terms of the formation of the state of what existed in terms of a state in the YAR was really under the Saleh period. And I think, one of its unities was really introducing centralized rule. I mean, people were always saying that, the YAR wasn't a state and wasn't centrally organized, but that isn't really true. I mean, he set up, particularly his security and police and military systems, which really did control the whole of the YAR, and indeed afterwards controlled the whole of the Republic of Yemen once the country was united. I'd say the main weaknesses really were, basically autocracy, the fact that he prevented the emergence of other forces, that that the democracy which happened in the YAR, and I think that's a point worth remembering. People always talk about it being a mock democracy, but it certainly was by no means a perfect democracy. But I think right now, given where we're living at the moment, we can raise some serious questions about what a proper democracy might be, and I won't go into that now. But the type of democracy in Yemen was seriously more. It was a more serious process than was happening certainly anywhere else in the Arabian Peninsula and probably in most of the Arab world. I mean, you did not have parliamentary elections did not produce a 99.9% victory. There were serious challenges. There was, a real opposition in the parliament. So although it was manipulated and Saleh made sure that his people always had the majority, we're not talking about a complete farce, as say we had in Tunisia under Ben Abdin, or various other places, let alone the complete lack of any democracy in the rest of the Arabian Peninsula for most of the time. So I think, that aspect could be seen as both a strength and a weakness. I'd say the main weaknesses were really in economic and social development, in the fact that, particularly, I think we'll probably talk about the economy later, so maybe I'll leave that out now. But when you look at social development, the Saleh regime built a massive infrastructure of roads. Admittedly, it's still a long way from perfect, but then if you look at the geography of Yemen, it's not an easy country to have a physical road infrastructure. But for example, the educational infrastructure was particularly weak and inadequate and vastly manipulated mainly by Islamists to prevent the development of the kind of education which would be necessary for future Yemen. So I'm not sure how we're doing for in your planned time of 10 minutes.
Well, I think perhaps we run to the next question. What about the PDOI? I mean, what legacies has the PDOI bequeathed?
I think the big difference between what its achievements were and what the legacy was, I would certainly, and I know, we've had these conversations before between us, and I recently published a piece on the PDRY in Jacobin, which people might like to read. Basically, I think the achievements of the PDRY were precisely the weaknesses of the YR, i.e. a very, very strong social development effort, mainly education and health and the provision of health. I think from the PDRY leaders' point of view, their fight against tribalism was another achievement. I would not necessarily agree about this because I'm not totally against tribes in principle. I think, that's again something else we could talk about. The weaknesses there were completely the political infighting within the ruling group. I think there's really little to argue about that. In terms of its legacy, I think the main thing that, I think its legacy is more of a myth in a sense than a reality. I mean, most people in what was the PDRY were born after unification. We're now 30 years into United Yemen or whatever. And so you have a situation where, people's memories or perceptions are not, certainly of younger people, are not related to any direct experience of what the system was. And even, their perceptions are also affected very much by how their parents, how their families, how their friends see it. I mean, I was very surprised about 10 years ago when I was, whenever I was in the ex-PDRY in the South, that people who discovered, though, I mean, I was made no secret of it, that I'd lived there in the 70s and 80s, were incredibly interested and really, really asking me, what was it like? How was life? What were, they were really, really wanting to know more about this. And I thought, why do they ask? Because their parents could tell them better than I could. But I think they wanted an external view. They wanted an outside view.
Yeah.
And that is, so what people who are now calling for Southern separatism, have no perception of what the Southern state was in the PDRY. And, whether their objectives are similar to what that state was is something that would be very interesting to know more about.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. But so what was unity inevitable? And has unity proved more stable or less stable than having two or more Yemens?
I wouldn't like to say that it was inevitable. I think it was something that most Yemenis wanted in the late 80s, or in fact throughout the 80s, as far as I know. And that, in the 80s, I lived in both the PDRY and the YR, so I got some kind of sense of that. So I think unity was very much a very widespread ambition that was very widely shared. Whether it was inevitable, I honestly couldn't answer. I really couldn't answer. I think, for example, that if the oil in Masila had been discovered before 1990, probably the PDRY wouldn't have gone in for unity because they wouldn't need to. And I think, you know, that may well be the case. I would say one thing, which is that, you know, in the days when Arab nationalism was an important ideology throughout the Middle East, and people were talking about Arab unity, I never took that seriously. I did not see, you know, that as a potential option, but I always thought that Yemeni unity was possible precisely because I feel there is this cultural nationhood you know, that covers Yemenis. Which is completely different from, say, the one that did happen, which was the unity between Egypt and Syria, which admittedly only lasted 3 years anyway. So I think that's you know, whether I couldn't say whether the Republic of Yemen is more or less stable. I wouldn't like to venture on that one. What's your view?
I'm just going to move on to the next section of the book because I try to get through as many of these questions as I can, which will help the audience. So I'm looking at the politics of disintegration. Reading it, I had some number of specific questions. Do you think the GPC, which is essentially Saleh's creation, has any relevance today?
I think the importance, the GPC was Saleh's creation. It was established as basically bringing together everybody that he possibly could bring together in support of himself staying in power. And it was created in 1982, but in the following years, it did create and establish itself as a political organization. I don't like to say party because its politics, you know, other than support for Saleh, really had a wide range. I mean, it went the range from, you know, Dr. Abdul Karim al-Iryani's hopes of what we could call a social democracy to basically, you know, pretty autocratic people and the other end. So it's not that it didn't have much political cohesion in terms of a program, but it had an institutional cohesion which covered the whole country. And, you know, in that sense, it was a very important and probably then the most important political institution in the country. It's been obviously enormously undermined by the situation that has emerged in the last 10 years, partly, of course, with the fact that it's literally physically split between those who are under Houthi rule, who basically have no option to say anything or that disagrees with Houthi positions. So really they've been turned into puppets, I think, effectively, or at least in terms of their open statements. What they might do in private, I wouldn't like to know. Well, I would like to know, but I can't say. So I think, you know, and then you have the GPC outside of Yemen, who is split into different groups. And also, you know, after 1990, the GPC included large numbers of people who had previously been in the Yemeni Socialist Party. And even after 1986, those who moved to Sana'a, who were defeated in 1986, many of them joined the GPC and became leaders of the GPC. So it didn't create a coherent politics, and it hasn't got now a coherent politics because it's torn between the sort of Abu Dhabi faction, the Oman faction, the Egypt faction, and those people inside. So I'd say, you know, I suspect its relevance today is not enormous. But I mean, that is my feeling. I'm happy to be proved wrong.
Well, look, what about Islam? Islam is seen as a strong influence. It's often labelled as being part of the Muslim Brotherhood, but is it part of the Brotherhood? Is it more of a sort of GPC with members and a section influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, there doesn't seem to be that much difference in that sense.
I think Islah is different. I mean, although it hasn't updated its program since I forget which year, it does actually have a program. It is And it is, I mean, it's a combination of two separate and diverse groups. I mean, on the one hand, the far northern Hashid tribesmen and their supporters, and also some Bakil basically in the highlands, i.e. those who haven't been taken over by either GPC or the Houthis, and Islamists in the rest of the country. Now, I think, the whole issue of the Muslim Brotherhood is something that still puzzles me, even though I've spent a bit of time trying to identify it. As far as I can identify, the Muslim Brotherhood is not an organization that has a headquarters somewhere or other with a president or a chairman and a group and a central committee who make decisions. It's, it's a grouping of different Islamists with vaguely similar ideologies. So I think, belonging to the Muslim Brotherhood is, in my view, pretty much a meaningless statement. But certainly, the Islamist section, which really are most Islahi supporters and the large numbers of Islahi supporters throughout the country, are people who have, who believe in a form of political Islam, and who, to some extent, I mean, they participated in elections and they want to be voted in. And I think their ideology varies. I mean, even if you look within the Islah, you have, a wide range of Islamist views, from what I'd call the milder version to something, pretty close to extremism. In terms of its influence, I think, obviously the Islah has suffered enormously in the last few years under Houthi rule, because the Houthis, don't want them, but also in the rest of the country because of the strong support of the Emiratis for anything that is anti-Muslim brother, and they identify the Islah as being Muslim brothers. What their definition of a Muslim brother is something that I'd like to see. But they have, actively tried to undermine and destroy them. I mean, they've even hired people to go and assassinate them. So we're talking about, serious, severe repression, and all those groups who are under UAE support and influence are also joining in. So they, at the same time, support UAE positions by being anti-Islah, and at the same time are fighting a political rival. However, I would suspect that the Islah still remains quite an important, relevant political entity, probably more so than others, largely due to the absence of others, not necessarily, due to their particular policies, but the fact that they are there and they are organized.
Yeah. I'm going to skip over the question about the Houthis, so I think we need to move on a bit. But perhaps we look at the transition for a moment, from 2011 to the start of the war, because you write at some length about that, about the GCC process and the reasons for its failures. But what were the fundamental problems? Why didn't it work?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. You froze for a second.
Why didn't the transition work? Following the Arab Spring, the GCC and UN intervention to set up or to develop a transition system, leading to national dialogue and changes in the government. But in the end, of course, it led to war. Now, what were the reasons for that failure?
Well, I think in retrospect, and I think now we're just 10 years after the transition, we can still talk about it. I think its significance is rapidly diminishing as time goes by, and it becomes more and more of an irrelevant episode in Yemeni history, or at least a minor episode in Yemeni history. I think basically what happened is that the GCC initiative stroke agreement was designed to do just a little bit more than cosmetic change in Yemen, was basically intended to bring some change, i.e. to replace Saleh, but not to bring in the kind of democracy and new society that most of the demonstrators in the street in 2011 were hoping for. Mainly because being the GCC and being, monarchies and pretty autocratic states themselves, they weren't likely to be promoting something that would bring about a seriously democratic and a sort of regime whose interest was focused on the majority of the population. So I think, the nature of the proposal was, of the agreement was such, and the way it was implemented was such, that there really wasn't any real possibility of leading to a solution. I think the main asset one can say about it, and I think that's not insignificant, is that it actually did postpone the war by 3 years. So,
yes.
at least that's another 3 years in which Yemenis weren't fighting each other. So I think that's probably one of the more positive things one can say about the transition. I think the other element, of course, was that the selection of Hadi as president was not enormously helpful. I mean, Hadi was not basically proper presidential material, I think I would say. And, not only, I mean, he did try a bit, but he failed to get any authority over the military. I think another big mistake, was the timing. I mean, and I think you remember that, Noel, we had these arguments at the time where I was saying 2 years is much too short. It's absolutely impossible to do all the things that need to be done in 2 years. And you were saying, no, but not just you, everybody else was saying, it's got to be done in 2 years. 2 years is the only time available, etc. And I think to do what was intended to be done would have needed more than 2 years. I mean, the first thing is that you should have had a sequencing rather than everything happening at the same time. And the sequencing should have started with providing a security sector reform that provided, that was able to enforce any decisions that were taken. And that never happened. So I think, there are many reasons why the transition failed, but I think, to save time, maybe I should not expand too much more on this topic. And also, as I said, I think now, I think if I started writing this book this year or next year, I forget how many pages it got in this book, but it probably would get half that amount of space.
Yeah, I'm going to put you one of the questions that's just come up in the chat. I think this might be the right time to ask it. Is, do you believe the Houthis can hold on to power in the north for years or even decades?
Sorry to say that I do.
Yes, I agree. Yes.
I mean, again, without going into great details about Houthi policies and the fact that, they're not by any means the kind of group one would like to see running Yemen, I think they can hang on for a while to come.
Yes. Yes, I agree. We might take up that further when we come to Q&A. So I'd like to move on to the economy now. You begin the economy chapter by talking about climate change. Why did you focus on climate change as the introduction to that?
Well, I mean, as you said, the book has had to follow this 4-chapter structure of the series. So I had to decide to put, to put things in places where they might not necessarily, I would have given a chapter to climate change on its own otherwise, but I couldn't. I think I gave it as a priority because it underlies most of the economic issues of the past, the present, and more so the future. And also, I used to talk, whenever I talked, I used to say climate change in Yemen is a real thing. It's already happening. It's important. And, unlike the rest of the world, it's already there now. It's the last 2 years have made so many changes in the rest of the world that I have to stop saying that, because the rest of the world has finally cottoned on to the fact that climate change is a serious problem. I mean, the rulers haven't, but the people have. So, we have a the climate change is incredibly important, particularly for agriculture, and we still have 70% of the population in rural areas who largely depend on agriculture, if not exclusively. It's incredibly important in terms of rising of sea levels, in the sense that, at least 2 of Yemen's major cities, plus at least 2 or 3 of its smallest cities on the coast. The whole fishing community would be affected by climate change. So there's a whole host of things, in addition to, every climate change disaster, every drought, every flood, is destroying existing infrastructure and existing possibilities and requires more cash and money to be addressed. So I think, putting it as a, it's not it's one of the major causes of economic problems and needs and should be addressed.
Okay. Yeah, well, you of course talk about the water again at some length, looming prospect of shortages and tires already facing serious problems, and Salah in the future. And talk about water management is the key to this. But what can be done to limit the impact and then mitigate it?
The thing about water is that if nothing is done within not very long, and certainly less than a generation, there will be large parts of Yemen which will no longer be inhabitable. And that means that their population will first move to the remaining habitable areas, which will create more social, political, and other tensions in those areas. And eventually they will cross the borders. Now, they could cross the sea and go to Somalia and Ethiopia. But at the moment, we still get more Somalis and Ethiopians coming into Yemen despite the war than going the other way. So my suspicion is that people will be moving inland. And where are they going to go? I mean, it's quite obvious. They will go to Oman, the Emirates eventually, and mainly Saudi Arabia. So it's very much in the interests of these states to contribute seriously in addressing this problem. And the problem is that as about 90% of Yemen's water, or something in that region, because all these are estimates, is used in agriculture, the primary policy that needs to be implemented is transferring is reducing agricultural water use and making sure that domestic use is available for people to drink, for domestic purposes, for industrial purposes, and also for livestock. So basically a relatively small reduction in agricultural use can solve the problem by ensuring that water is available for these other purposes, which will allow people to continue living in the country. And this, this requires very strong, determined policy on the part of a state, to enforce these decisions. Because again, although it is complicated, and at one level, what I've just explained is quite simple, the situation is not identical throughout the country. Some areas have more water and others have less. So you need a fairly sophisticated policy, but it can be done. And, the important thing is to have a combination of, fairly enforced mechanism to, cut down on deep well irrigation, basically, and to focus on providing domestic water to everybody. And then to have a very sophisticated local different policies with high levels of participatory approaches at the local level, for all these things. So it's a dual solution. There is a solution. I mean, Yemenis can continue living in Yemen, provided, you stop using so much water in agriculture.
But how does that, another point I think you made here in some of your writings is the difference between irrigation and rain-fed agriculture, or rain-fed irrigation as opposed to well irrigation. I presume this is what you're talking about here, that the well water essentially for the towns and rain-fed for the agriculture.
Well, yes, and I mean, well, they also need, need rainwater and, water for people to drink in rural areas. No, I mean, one of the big failures of economic policies during the Saleh period, and for which I think he was partly to blame, but I think the international development agencies also have a serious part of the share of blame, is the fact that what has been promoted in agriculture has been irrigated crops for export. I mean, the absurdity of Yemen, one of the most water scarce countries in the world, exporting its water in the shape of mangoes and bananas is just, comparable to some recent events in this country, I would say. What is, and what has not been done, there's been no research and no effort in developing rain-fed crops. And, for people to be able to continue living in agriculture, they need high-value rain-fed crops so that they can, market them. And they also need much more, drought resistant and other resistant to all other and fast maturing, etc., staple crops like sorghum, wheat, etc. And there's been absolutely no research done on this in the last decades. And to me, that is a massive failure. And the reason, irrigated agriculture was encouraged is both because the financial agencies were supporting it, but also very much because it fitted in with Saleh's policies, because, the wealthier big tribal farmers in certain areas were irrigating their gat and their mangoes and their bananas, etc. And becoming richer at the expense of smallholders whose wells were drying up, whose shallow wells were drying up. So, these are policy issues that I think, were very fundamental problems.
Yeah.
And need urgent action.
Yeah, okay. I just want to move very briefly on to the hydrocarbons. It's the most important source of cash to the government, but also of disputes about who controls them and how the proceeds are shared. Do you think that the policies like can this be managed in a way that would give the widest benefits to society? I mean, given the location of these married gas, which actually requires a pipeline to the southern coast, and the location of oil and gas in Hadramaut, and limited in the northern areas of Yemen.
I think if you're talking about the hydrocarbons, their site of origin is clear, and in different governorates under different leaderships. I mean, this is the kind of thing where, a federal regime that is carefully managed and that has the interests of the population at large can work out an adequate way of addressing it. I mean, partly, certainly the areas, for example, through which pipelines go, they can get their share of transit fees, as is done in other countries at an international level. But, that is somewhere where a division between central authority and regional authority can be done. Again, it's all a matter of having a regime that is concerned with the welfare of the population.
Yeah.
Quite feasible. I think it's also important to remember that, Yemeni hydrocarbons are minimal. I mean, the quantities are incredibly insignificant and compared to what exists in the rest of the peninsula and many other places in relation to the population. So again, there's no way hydrocarbons can solve Yemen's economic problems. They can certainly contribute far better to development and to a development useful for the population than they have done in the past. I think there's no doubt about that. But they are not the full solution to the whole problem.
Yeah, but control them lead to problems. Can I just to finish this section off, can we just say something briefly about the current problems with the central bank, the two central bank currency? Is there anything that you see? I mean, it's a major problem, but can you see any solution to it?
I'm not a banker, and it's taken me a lot of effort to just simply master the basics of this situation. I mean, basically what you now have is a similar situation to that in Libya. You have two central banks that are rival, one of which is recognized by the world and has the SWIFT codes, and the other one, is not recognized by the world and has some other codes which are really important. The impact on the population is enormous because you have one area where the exchange rate to the dollar is about close to 600, 590 or whatever, and the other way it's around 1100 or 1200. Yeah. So, the cost of living and given that Yemen imports 90% of its basic, staples, or particularly wheat, and 100% of its rice, etc. The exchange rate of the dollar or the Saudi riyal is enormously important, and therefore the situation of the central bank is, a crucial one. So the Houthis suffer a lot of restrictions, but they still have control over some of the major banks and of the big businesses that are based in Sana'a. And the internationally recognized government is waiting for the $2 billion that were promised on 7th of April or whatever it was, 6th or 8th of April, to replenish their central bank in Aden so that they can provide letters of credit to the traders to import wheat, etc.
Yeah.
The solution, I mean, the long-term solution, of course, is to reunite it into a single bank. And the more short-term solution would be to facilitate transfers and facilitate processes, you know, for imports. And that we're talking here about the Hodeidah blockade on the one hand, and the $2 billion to Aden central bank. So I think that, I mean, without going, you know, we need a proper banker to address these issues.
I thought it's just such a key question, though. And of course, the Saudis and UAE say they can't deliver the money because they want to make sure it gets to the people who need it, which was what, of course, the aid agencies used to say in the past. But can we just move on very briefly to the final section, so we can open up this number of Q&As accumulating, which I hope we can get to. But I mean, I really want two questions in this section. You make the point that never has been isolated; it's connected internationally, but also that Saudi Arabia will always have a looming presence in Yemen. Special concern over the borders in the past, both in the imminent and the YR times. Could you say a few words about the relationship? How are these managed by the Saudis, and how are these seen from the Yemeni perspective? What are the Saudi aims? What are the continuing Saudi aims in Yemen? What does Saudi Arabia want from Yemen?
A bit embarrassed answering this question, Noel, because I know you know a lot more about this than I do. So it's really a bit unfair for you to be asking me about the Saudi role, but you're far better informed than I am. You know, I mean, I think the fundamental, I mean, number one, let's recognize that things have changed enormously with Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, we're in a different world. We've got a different Saudi Arabia to deal with. I think that's the first thing. I think, you know, in the past, I think, you know, basically the Saudis did, and I think correctly, regard Yemen as part of their backyard. It is physically, you know, geographically, it is their backyard. They were concerned on the one hand about the large population, which they saw as a threat. I'm not, to be honest, I really don't know why. The Yemenis have been dependent on Saudi for decades by, you know, exporting their labor to Saudi, and therefore you have millions of Yemenis who have direct experience of living in Saudi pre-MBS, and quite a few still under MBS. So, you know, I think at this point, you know, in MBS Saudi, I suspect that the main thing they want is secure borders, no attacks, no cross-border attacks. Ideally, I think they'd want to forget about Yemen if they possibly could, but they want to minimize their involvement, and they want to carry on focusing on such amazing, fantastic things as NEOM, the line, the all summer winter sports in competitions near the Israeli border, and such like things which you know, which are maybe of great intellectual interest. I'm not sure about how realistic any of them are. So I would say that the Saudis, you know, at this point in time, they want out with a minimum damage. They recognize that they're going to have to cough up some money, that they won't be able to, but probably, you know, paying off a few Yemenis is a lot cheaper than all the bombs that they've been sending. And it's just conceivable the Americans will stop replenishing them. So, you know, they've got some concerns in that front. I said just conceivable in the next couple of years, okay? After the 2024 elections, we're in a different ball game.
Or even after the midterms, we might find it change in Washington. I don't know, we should see. Yeah. All right, taking all that together, I mean, do you think a peace is possible in the near future, or is it something that is just going to be illusory, and this conflict will just drift on in one way or another?
I think the truce that Grunberg achieved was a big achievement. He achieved it partly thanks to his own skills, but also because I think what I was just saying, the Saudis, you know, really want out. They want to reduce it. The Emiratis were, in my view, quite surprisingly shaken by the attack on Abu Dhabi in January. and that's affected them. So they also really, want out. I think most of them want to get out of this. They were hoping that the truce and the creation of the PLC would solve the problem. The truce has now expired. Full-scale fighting hasn't started, but it might. Though my feeling is that the aerial attacks will not start unless there are Houthi cross-border missiles, drones, whatever. I think my perception is that some kind of deal is likely to be signed within the next 18 months or so. I think it's also increasingly likely that there might be, and I'm saying might, I mean, I really don't want to stick my head out too far on this one, a bilateral deal between and the Houthis, which would give the Saudis, a quiet border, which is what they want. And then they can forget about it. I think the IRG and the rest of it, the PLC has not solved the problem. I don't think it could solve the problem, not unless some very fundamental changes are made to it. What I suspect may happen in coming months is that we'll have the kind of war we would have had in 2015 if there had not been the international involvement at that time. An internal fighting within Yemen between the different factions, and possibly more than one of these. In the long run, I hope that somehow, a serious peace can be achieved, but I think it will take a long time. So I'm sorry about that.
Well, again, I would add, for the Saudis, obviously the Iranian aspect is very important, and the evidence. I was all very skeptical initially about the degree of Iranian involvement, but the evidence is growing and growing all the time. That is going to be, that would be a major factor from the Saudi perspective. They want to see any deal removing what they would see as a threat on their southern border.
The problem is that, if the Houthis, I mean, of course, they're happy with the Iranian support, but they can carry on without it.
Yes, yeah, yes, they could, yeah.
So, the solution between the Saudis and the Houthis is not, they may think it's to do with Iran, but it isn't, in the sense that, Iran is a factor, but it's not the determining factor. At least that's the way I see it.
Okay. Well,
but I really wouldn't like people. I mean, we do have an audience here. It's not just a conversation you.
No, I'm just about to bring
think that I have a crystal ball and that I know what's going to happen. I have no idea what is going to happen.
Well,
I have no inside view. I really don't know.
But just my final question is: do you think that there will be one or two Yemens at the end of this, or even more?
I think there will either be one or a lot more than two.
Yeah.
I don't think they will have two states along the pre-1990 borders. I mean, coming back to what we were saying earlier, the 1934 border is completely absurd. And if you look at the divisions, both in the former YAR and in the former PDRY, there is no basis for unity within those former borders. I think in the north you would have clearly different entities in places like Taiz, the Tihama, Marib, and in the south, I mean, the number of divisions are so enormous, potential divisions are so enormous that simply going back to the pre-1986 or to the 1986 conflict does not answer it. So in a sense, one of the many reasons I think United Yemen is a good idea, but maybe on a federal basis, is because it is far better than having a Somalia.
Yeah. An unstable, we've got going to a question answer, an unstable United Yemen may actually be more stable than the alternative of a number of Yemens, which would bound to be at conflict over those resources. We talked about the hydrocarbons at the start, resources.
Well, I hope that all these questions and this rather disconnected or rather, extravagant conversation we've had will persuade people that they might like to read the book.
Okay, well, there's plenty of questions coming up from the audience. I'd just like to get it. Ask one or two of them now.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Helen. There's one final comment here. A magnificent session. We'll be buying your book. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for
also,
organizing this. And thanks to everybody for participating and listening. So thanks for your questions and your comments. And it's been an interesting hour and a half.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for all the questions. I'm sorry I didn't, there was still one or two left. But thank you very much. I say a terrific thank you to Helen, because this is, this is pure gold, I think, what we heard. And it's great that the British-Yemeni Society was able to produce it. So thank you for participating, and thank you to Helen for such a very long session.
Thanks to Ibrahim for your work, even though we can't see you.
Oh, you must thank Ibrahim, yes. He's helped.
You're very welcome. Great talk. Thank you, everyone. This will be available on YouTube in the next couple of days. There is a link to Helen's book in the chat. But if you have any questions, do go on our website, www.b-ys.org.uk, and I will also list a link for Helen's book there with a discount from her publisher. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.